Chapter 10. In one of two wooden houses near the steel mills, the Thorns resided. These houses were built by Evander Drake and James Thorn for their families when they began to manufacture steel. As time passed, Evander Drake became wealthy and moved his family into a fashionable home in the city's posh area. Society accepted them as equals. James Thorn, on the other hand, had a large family but a small income, so he had to continue living in the same brown house near the steel mills. The Thorn family held on to their English ways and knew little of society. The English and Germans are known to cling to their old habits and customs, which they carry with them across oceans and mountains. It will take generations before we can predict the national type of an American citizen. On the British Isles, the mixture of centuries of European blood has developed a virility of body and brain that dominates the globe. James Thorn was proud of his race and family blood. He came from a well-bred English household, but his current environment limited him. In England, ill health, and now in America, ill treatment made him miss golden opportunities. Unless good qualities are inbred, it is almost impossible for a person in one stratum of society to be lifted up into another, just as it is impossible for the geological strata of the earth to change positions. James Thorn's grandmother had good blood in her veins. She came from a family that had performed valiant deeds in war and peace. James Thorn's father had made a mistake in judgment, and a large estate, partially inherited, was swept away like a flood. He died, leaving James, the eldest son, to support his mother and several children. James Thorn was now over 50 years old, and he often wondered if he or his children could retrieve their family prestige. He still had energy, unconquerable determination, and faith in himself. These are essential elements in a successful character, but fate had decreed adversely thus far. Despite a less than optimal early education, he dedicated at least 2 hours a day to reading, keeping up with current events, and gaining a helpful knowledge of science. When his oldest son George was born, he was determined to provide his children with the best education possible. 2 of his daughters were teaching in public schools, while May Thorn taught music. 2 of his sons worked in the mills, one as a chemist and the other as an electrician. Another son was a conductor on a passenger train, and the 4th was studying to become a physician. After a long day at the mills, the father and his son George spent much time working on a problem that could revolutionize many things. Twice they thought they were on the verge of a solution, but unforeseen obstacles always got in their way. It was no surprise that the father was proud of George, who had become a respected chemist at the vast steel works. As a boy, George worked nights, Saturdays, and during his vacations in the mills. The men came to know and love his genial ways and fair methods, and he gained a good knowledge of steel-making. The father was insistent that George should not miss a single day of school. Eventually, George graduated from high school with the esteem of his teachers and classmates. During the 12 years he spent in public school, he acquired a fine discipline of mind, a love of science, and enough Latin and Greek to aid him in determining the derivation and exact meaning of words. Coeducation also refined his nature and enabled him to correctly estimate his own abilities. But best of all, he had come to know Laura, the second daughter of Evander Drake, who graduated in his own class. During their senior year, George frequently walked and talked with Laura and learned about her plans. Laura's parents, especially her mother, were anxious that both their daughters should attend private schools. Kimberly was easily persuaded to attend a young ladies' seminary where aesthetic accomplishments were emphasized and considered essential for gaining entry into good society. But Laura decided to pursue a public school education. Kimberly and Laura were fond of each other as sisters, but Kimberly was more self-centered, while Laura preferred to think of others before herself. Laura had learned early on how to retain old friends or win new ones with a smile or a bow. She spent very little time thinking about her own needs, preferring to take flowers or fruit, even when given to her, to some sick or aged person. Nothing pleased her more than to visit the old lady's home with a few gifts and read the Bible or comforting stories to the residents. Mrs. Drake, while on a trip to the east, happened to spend a June day at Wellesley College near Boston. Under the pale light of the moon, hundreds of Wellesley girls and thousands of onlookers gathered on the banks of Lake Waban to witness the float. College crews in their colorful flotillas formed a star-shaped formation near the shore for their annual concert. Chinese lanterns resembling giant fireflies swayed in the trees and on many elegant boats. The silver notes of the bugle and the melody of youthful voices transformed the college world into a magical realm. Kimberly and her mother were both enchanted, and Kimberly decided to enroll at Wellesley. However, the rigorous academic demands and the daily 45 minutes of domestic work did not suit her nature, and after a few weeks she opted for a change and continued her education at a private school on the Back Bay in Boston. Laura, on the other hand, possessed a more active mind and ambition. She aspired to receive an education as good as her brother Alfonso's at Harvard. She read about a prominent benefactor who believed that women had the same right as men to intellectual culture and development. In 1861, he founded an institution on the Hudson, midway between Albany and New York, which he hoped would accomplish for women what colleges were doing for men. Laura applied for admission and was accepted into Vassar College. She was assigned rooms in Strong Hall. She appreciated Vassar's sensible way of hazing, where freshmen were warmly welcomed by the sophomores. She was glad to have both male and female professors, as this partly fulfilled her idea of the education that women should receive. At Vassar, Laura encountered several girls from Drakeville whom she knew, but no boys. She wrote to her mother that she would be happier if Vassar had fewer Greek classes and more boys. She could not comprehend why co-education at the high school in Drakeville, which worked perfectly, should not extend to Vassar and other women's and men's colleges. The following 2 years on the scenic Hudson were joyful for Laura. She excelled in mathematics, was proficient in Latin, and was passionate about the study of psychology, the science of the mind that teaches the intimate relationship of mental phenomena to the physical organism. German was an elective course for Laura, which she had studied at high school, but at Vassar she learned to write and speak the language with accuracy and fluency, which is not typical unless one lives in a German family. Laura was already planning to study history and some of the sciences in original German textbooks if the opportunity arose. She cared little for music, although she was extremely fond of poetry and occasionally contributed verses for publication. Her essay on architecture at the end of the second year received applause from the students and praise in red ink across the first page of the composition. Self-government of the Vassar girls fosters self-respect and self-control. A Vassar girl is bound by her honor to retire every night at 10 o'clock, with 3 exceptions a month, to exercise in the gymnasium for 3 hours a week, and to engage in at least 1 hour of outdoor exercise daily. Laura was preparing herself for a noble position in the world through regular exercise, meals, sleep, and mental work. At Vassar, she found mental rest and physical strength through activities such as tennis, basketball, rowing, skating, biking, birdwatching, photography, and flower picking. She also enjoyed the tree and trig ceremonies and amateur dramatic performances. Laura was sad to leave Vassar after 2 years, but her friends threw her a farewell fudge party, where they made fudge by melting sugar, milk, butter, and chocolate in a kettle over a gas stove. The Vassar girls had a sweet tooth and loved fudge parties, which often led to love stories and fun. After a vacation in the Adirondacks, Laura decided to finish her education at Smith College on the Connecticut River. Educating a whole family at one alma mater was no longer the norm, as different colleges had different methods of character development. James Thorn had sent his son George to the Polytechnic Institute at Troy for 2 years, but financial troubles prevented him from continuing. Mrs. Drake, possibly at Laura's suggestion, offered to fund George's last year at the institute, which he happily accepted. George had spent his last vacation days with Laura in the Adirondacks and had revealed some of his life plans to her, which he had never shared with anyone before. They were on Saranac Lake, drifting in a canoe under the moonlight, when George shared his struggles and his trade knowledge gained from working in a steel mill. Mrs. Drake was proud of her daughter's beauty and style, which often caught people's attention. George returned to the institute with high hopes, guided by his love for Laura and his determination to succeed. From a young age, George Thorn understood the power of knowledge and the influence of intellect and wealth. He confided in Laura that she had sparked his ambition, and he was determined to make a success of his life. "Laura, I need you as my friend in this struggle," he implored. "Always your friend, George," she replied, and he knew she meant every word. Her sincerity had captured his heart long ago, and her kindness and support had guided him on his journey. Years passed, and both Laura and Kimberly were present at George's graduation from Troy. It was a shame that his own parents, who had sacrificed so much for him, could not attend. George was aware of a strong force within him, pushing him forward, but he could not identify its source. He felt fortunate to be guided by the winds of heaven as his ship sailed towards success. George pursued a 3-year course at the Institute, leading up to a Bachelor of Science degree. He focused less on higher mathematics and more on natural history, chemistry, and geology. The Institute was close to engineering works and manufacturing plants, providing George with valuable opportunities for investigation and observation. His graduating thesis, a design for an electrical steel plant with working details, capacity 1,000 tons per diem, received much praise, particularly for its detailed drawings. As George prepared to leave Troy, he said reluctant goodbyes to professors, classmates, and townspeople who had grown fond of him. Life in Troy had been an education in itself, as he was surrounded by young men from cultured families. George locked the door of his old study room, but then unlocked it and entered once more. He took one last look around, recalling fond memories, before finally locking the door and heading to the train station to meet Laura and Kimberly. George had been eager to start his studies at the Institute, but now his heart was heavy as he faced the prospect of returning to the old Drakeville mills. No road lay before him except the one that led back to his hometown. In the past few years, George's outlook had improved slightly, but the knowledge he gained only made him more aware of the limited world he and his family inhabited. How could he provide for 2 people if Laura were to say yes? As he stepped onto the train platform, a classmate handed him a letter with the Drakeville Iron and Steel Company printed on the envelope. George, assuming it was from his father, eagerly tore it open and read the contents. His face first flushed with emotion, then lit up with joy. "Good news, I hope," Laura said as she and her sister approached. "Yes, Laura, read it for yourself. Having connections is truly valuable." The 2 sisters were thrilled and heartily congratulated George. "Will you accept the position?" Laura asked. "Your father is very kind to you, and I believe I could perform the duties of chemist satisfactorily," George replied. "We can discuss this further later, Laura." The 3 happy young people purchased tickets for home and settled into a Pullman car. After a week of rest, George Thorn began his role as assistant chemist for the Drakeville Iron and Steel Company. 2 weeks of training under the old chemist, whose health was deteriorating, was enough to give young Thorn the skills and confidence he needed for his desirable position.